Hey everyone, welcome back to Beast History. Let's start with a simple question. Who is the richest person who ever lived? Right now, you're probably picturing a tech billionaire in a minimalist turtleneck, or maybe a Gilded Age industrialist, a Rockefeller or a Carnegie, surrounded by steel mills and railroad monopolies. You might think of ancient Roman emperors or even a legendary king from a storybook, a Midas with a golden touch. But all of them, every single one, are small time compared to the man we're talking about today. The truth is, the richest human being who ever walked the earth was a 14th century African emperor. His name was Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire. And when we say rich, we're not talking about a number you can write down. His wealth wasn't something you could quantify with a Forbes list. His fortune was so vast, so beyond the comprehension of his time, that when he decided to take a vacation, his spending literally broke the economy of the entire Mediterranean world. This isn't a story about accumulating wealth. This is a story about what happens when wealth becomes a physical force of nature, a golden tsunami that reshapes nations, builds cities, and changes the course of history itself. This is the story of the one man who had too much money, and the world that was forever altered when he decided to spend it. To really understand the sheer shockwave that Mansa Musa was about to send across the globe, we first need to understand the world he was about to step into. It's the early 1300s. Let's take a quick tour. Over in Europe, things are a mess. The continent is a fractious, paranoid patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, all jockeying for power. England and France are gearing up for a fight that will last a century, the creatively named 100 Years' War. The Holy Roman Empire is a chaotic mess of internal politics. The Pope has literally abandoned Rome and is living in Avignon, France, a move that does not exactly scream stability and divine confidence. To the Europeans, the world map is a small, claustrophobic place. Their knowledge of Africa barely extends beyond the Mediterranean coast. To them, the vast interior of the continent, south of the Sahara Desert, is a massive, terrifying blank space they call the Green Sea of Darkness. It's a land of myth and monsters, a place from which nothing and no one of consequence is expected to emerge. They had no idea they were living next door to one of the most powerful and organized empires on the planet. Now, let's travel east to the heart of the Islamic world. Here, the situation is completely different. The dominant power is the Mamluk Sultanate, based in Cairo, Egypt. The Mamluks were a bizarre and fascinating warrior caste, originally slave soldiers who had seized power for themselves, and they were formidable. They had famously defeated the Mongols, something almost no one else had managed to do. Their capital, Cairo, was one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the world. It was a bustling metropolis of soaring minarets, sprawling markets, and formidable fortresses. It was the gateway between East and West, the center of global trade and scholarship. The Mamluk Sultan, a man named Al-Nasir Mohammed, was powerful, sophisticated, and like most rulers of ancient and powerful states, he was pretty confident he had seen it all. He thought he knew who all the major players on the world stage were. He was about to get the surprise of his life. Because far to the south, beyond the Sahara that the Mamluks considered the edge of their world, an empire was sitting on a literal mountain of gold. And it wasn't just gold. The Mali Empire was built on a foundation of two resources, each so valuable they were practically interchangeable: gold and salt. Let's start with the gold. We're not talking about a few decent mines. The primary source of Mali's wealth was a legendary region known as Wangara. The exact location of the Wangaran goldfields was one of the most closely guarded secrets in human history. To this day, historians aren't entirely sure where they were, though most suspect they were in the forested highlands of modern Guinea. The Malians didn't mine the gold in the traditional sense, with deep shafts and tunnels. Most of it was alluvial gold, found in riverbeds and deposits just under the surface. It was so plentiful you could literally pull it out of the ground. The trade in this gold was shrouded in mystery. For centuries, merchants from North Africa would travel south with their caravans, seeking to trade for it. But they never met the miners. The trade was conducted through a strange and fascinating ritual known as the silent trade or dumb barter. The North African merchants would arrive at a designated spot, usually a riverbank, and lay out their goods: fine cloth, tools, copper, and most importantly, salt. Then they would beat their drums to announce their presence and retreat out of sight. The Wangaran miners would then emerge from the forests, inspect the goods, and place a pile of gold dust next to each item they wished to purchase. They would then retreat. The merchants would come back, and if they were satisfied with the amount of gold, they would take it and leave the goods. If not, they would retreat again, and the miners would return to add more gold or take their initial offer back. This entire transaction happened without a single word being spoken between the two parties. This method built a deep, almost sacred trust over generations, and it served another crucial purpose. It kept the location of the goldfields a complete secret. The Mali emperors didn't control the source of the gold directly, but they controlled everything and everyone around it. They taxed every ounce of gold that moved north, and this tax revenue alone was enough to make them fantastically wealthy. But gold was only half of the equation. The other half was salt. Now in our modern world, salt is so cheap it's basically free. We complain about having too much of it. But in the pre-modern era, especially in West Africa, salt was life. It was white gold. The human body needs salt to survive, especially in a hot climate. But even more importantly, salt was the only reliable way to preserve food before refrigeration. It allowed people to preserve meat and fish indefinitely, which meant they could survive droughts and famines. It was a strategic resource of the highest order. And while West Africa had an almost infinite supply of gold, it had virtually no salt. The salt came from the opposite direction, the north, from the middle of the Sahara Desert. In desolate, sun-blasted places like Taghaza, miners would cut massive, pure blocks of salt directly from the dried-up ancient seabeds beneath the sand. The conditions were hellish. There was nothing there but salt. The workers lived in houses made of salt, slept on slabs of salt, and the only water they had was brackish and barely drinkable. The one thing they had in abundance was the one thing they couldn't eat. Their very survival depended on the caravans bringing them food. So here is the genius of the Mali Empire's economic system. It sat directly on the crossroads of the two most valuable commodities in the region. The emperors controlled the flow of salt south and the flow of gold north. They held the monopoly on life itself. Caravans of thousands of camels would trudge south from the Sahara, each camel laden with heavy blocks of salt. They would arrive in the markets of Timbuktu and Jen, and there, the salt would be traded for gold. At the height of the empire, a block of salt was often worth its exact weight in gold. Imagine that. A pound of the stuff you sprinkle on your fries being worth a pound of pure, glittering gold. The emperors of Mali took a piece of every single transaction, and they had been doing this for nearly a century before Mansa Musa even enters our story. This empire wasn't just a business enterprise, though. It was a nation forged in legend, with a founding story as epic as anything from ancient Greece or Rome. It's the story of a man who was supposed to be a footnote, a disabled prince who became a legend. Sundiata Keita, the original Lion King. Sundiata was born around the year 1217. His father was the king of a small Mandinka kingdom, and prophecy had foretold that he would be a great ruler. But there was a problem. Sundiata was born a cripple. He couldn't walk. His legs were weak and useless, and he had a speech impediment. In a society that valued physical strength and prowess above all else, he was an object of pity and ridicule. While the other princes trained for war and hunting, Sundiata crawled on the floor. His own mother was mocked relentlessly. He was the shame of the royal family. Things went from bad to worse. When Sundiata's father died, his half-brother took the throne, and Sundiata and his mother were cast aside, treated with contempt and cruelty. But the real threat came from outside. A new, terrifying power was rising in the region. The Sasso kingdom, led by a brutal and powerful sorcerer king named Saumyoro Kant. Saumyoro wasn't just a conqueror, he was a monster from a nightmare. The epics say he practiced dark magic, that his fortress was decorated with the skulls of defeated kings, that he wore clothing made from human skin. He was a tyrant who crushed anyone who stood in his way. He conquered Sundiata's homeland and killed most of the royal family. He allowed Sundiata to live because, in his arrogance, he saw a crippled boy as no threat at all. It was the biggest mistake he would ever make. Forced into exile, Sundiata and his mother wandered through West Africa, seeking refuge in one kingdom after another. And as he grew, something began to change. The years of humiliation had forged an iron will within him. The epic tells of a pivotal moment when his mother, desperate to cook a baobab leaf, a common food, was insulted by one of the other royal wives. In a rage at his mother's humiliation, Sundiata decided he would not crawl another day. He called for the royal blacksmith to forge him an iron rod. Grasping the rod, with superhuman effort, he pulled himself to his feet for the very first time. The rod, they say, bent into the shape of a bow. He had not just overcome his disability, he had transformed it into a symbol of his strength. Word of the exiled prince who could now walk, a prince who carried the legacy of his murdered family, began to spread. The Mandinka people, suffering under Saumyoro's tyranny, were desperate for a leader. Sundiata, now a charismatic and powerful young man, began to gather allies, uniting the scattered Mandinka clans who chafed under Sasso rule. He was a brilliant military strategist and a natural leader, and soon he had an army at his back. The inevitable showdown came at the Battle of Carina, around the year 1235. It was more than just a battle. It was a clash between two worlds. Saumyoro, the sorcerer king, confident in his dark powers, and Sundiata, the lion prince, leading a rebellion fueled by desperation and hope. The legends say that Saumyoro's magic was strong. Arrows bounced harmlessly off his skin, but Sundiata had an advantage. He had learned the secret of Saumyoro's power. The sorcerer's tana, or spiritual taboo, was a rooster's spur. His magic was vulnerable to it. Sundiata tipped an arrow with the spur of a rooster, and in the heat of the battle he fired it. The arrow grazed Saumyoro's shoulder, and his power was broken. The sorcerer king, seeing his magic fail him, turned and fled the battlefield, disappearing into the mountains, never to be seen again. With this victory, Sundiata Keita united the Mandinka people and founded the Mali Empire. He was no longer Sundiata the cripple, he was Mansa Sundiata, the Lion King. He established the capital at Nyani and created the Jibara, or Great Assembly, a council of clan leaders to govern the new empire. He established a framework of law and order that brought peace and prosperity to the region. He was the George Washington and the King Arthur of his people, a figure of history and myth combined. He created the stage upon which our story's main character would make his entrance. And that brings us to Musa. He was born around the year 1280. He was the grandnephew of the great Sundiata Keita, but he was not in the direct line of succession. He was not supposed to be emperor. The path that led him to the throne is one of the strangest and most fascinating stories of abdication in history. It involves a man with more power and wealth than almost anyone on earth, who gave it all up to chase a ghost across the ocean. The emperor on the throne before Musa was his predecessor, Mansa Abu Bakr II. Abu Bakr was the ruler of this vast, secure, and phenomenally wealthy empire. He had everything a king could ever want, but he was possessed by an idea, an obsession. He looked at the western edge of his empire, at the vast, churning expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, and he refused to believe that it was infinite. The prevailing wisdom of his time, and indeed of most of the world, was that the ocean was an impassable boundary, a sea of darkness. But Abu Bakr was convinced that it was just another sea, and that it must have another shore on the other side. He became determined to find it, so he launched a project that must have seemed like madness to his court. He ordered the construction of a massive fleet. 200 ships were built and filled with men, and another 100 were filled with supplies. Gold, water, and food enough to last for years. He gave the commander of this fleet one simple, impossible order: sail west until you either find the other side or you run out of supplies. The fleet departed, and for a long, long time nothing was heard. Then one day a single ship reappeared. The captain was brought before Mansa Abu Bakr. He told a strange and terrifying story. He said that the fleet had sailed for a long time until they came to a place in the middle of the ocean that felt like a great river, a violent current that swept them away. One by one, the ships were pulled into this current and disappeared. Terrified, he had turned his own ship around and fled back to Mali, the lone survivor of a doomed expedition. Now, a normal ruler would have heard this story and concluded that the ocean was indeed an impassable death trap. But Abu Bakr was not a normal ruler. He heard the story of a great river in the sea and became more convinced than ever that something lay beyond the horizon. The captain's story wasn't a warning. To Abu Bakr, it was a clue. He decided that the first expedition had failed because it was too small, too timid. He decided he needed to lead the next one himself. He did something that is almost without precedent in history. He abdicated the throne. He gave up absolute power over the wealthiest empire on earth to pursue a dream. He ordered an even bigger fleet to be built, 2,000 ships, 1,000 for his crew, and another 1,000 packed to the brim with supplies. He gathered the best sailors, scholars, and navigators. He appointed his deputy, a man named Musa, to serve as regent in his absence. He told Musa that if he did not return after a designated time, then Musa should assume the throne and become the new Mansa. And then Mansa Abu Bakr II sailed west into the Atlantic with his 2,000 ships and was never seen or heard from again. So let's just pause on that for a moment. You have an emperor, Abu Bakr II, who has everything: power, wealth, security. And he gives it all up to sail into the unknown, a mission with almost no chance of success. Was this an act of incredible, visionary courage, a noble pursuit of knowledge? Or was it the ultimate act of royal negligence, abandoning his people and his responsibilities for a personal fantasy? What do you think? Let me know your honest opinion in the comments below. Whatever the answer, one thing was clear: the throne now belonged to Musa. He was no longer a regent, a placeholder. He was the Mansa. And he wasn't the kind of man to just sit back and enjoy his inheritance. If Abu Bakr was the dreamer, Musa was the pragmatist, the builder. He immediately set about securing and expanding the empire he now controlled. He wasn't content to just tax the trade routes. He wanted to own them outright. He was a brilliant military commander, and he launched a series of campaigns that pushed the borders of the empire to their greatest extent. His most important conquests were the two great trading cities of the Niger River bend, Timbuktu and Gao. These cities were legendary hubs of commerce, the endpoints for the trans-Saharan caravans. By capturing them, Musa seized direct control over the entire trade network. He didn't just have a toll booth on the highway anymore. He owned the entire road, every rest stop, and the final destination. His grip on the gold and salt trade was now absolute. At its height under Musa, the Mali Empire stretched for 2,000 miles, from the Atlantic coast in the west to the modern-day borders of Niger in the east. It encompassed all or part of modern-day Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. It was one of the largest empires in the world at the time, larger than all of Western Europe combined. And it was incredibly well run. Musa was more than just a conqueror, he was a brilliant administrator. He divided the empire into provinces, each governed by a loyal farba or governor. He established a system of laws that was enforced across his vast domain, making travel and trade remarkably safe. The great 14th century traveler Ibn Battuta, who would visit Mali a few years after Musa's death, would write about the complete security of the empire. He noted that a traveler, even a lone woman, could journey across the entire country without any fear of robbers or violence. This level of peace and order was almost unheard of in the 14th century world. It was a testament to the stability and good governance that Musa had established. He had inherited a phenomenally wealthy kingdom, and through his own skill and ambition, he had made it a true superpower. For over a decade, Mansa Musa ruled over this vast, peaceful, and ridiculously prosperous empire. He had unimaginable wealth, absolute power, and total security. But there was one thing missing. In the grand scheme of the world, his empire was invisible. The great powers in Cairo, Damascus, and Fez knew of a rich land to the south, but they had no real concept of its scale or sophistication. The Europeans had no idea it even existed. Musa was the most powerful man they had never heard of. He was a devout Muslim, and for a man of his stature, there was one religious duty that was also the ultimate political and public relations opportunity: the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca. Sometime around the year 1324, Mansa Musa made a decision. He would go to Mecca, but he wasn't just going to perform a religious ritual. He was going to announce his arrival on the world stage. He wasn't just going to visit the old centers of Islamic power. He was going to show them what real power and what real wealth looked like. He was about to assemble a caravan so large, so opulent, so mind-bogglingly extravagant, that it would not only get him noticed, it would leave a scar on the global economy for a generation. The world had no idea what was coming. The golden tsunami was about to be unleashed. All right, so Mansa Musa has made his decision. He's going on the Hajj. But when an emperor of Mali decides to take a trip, he doesn't just pack a suitcase and book a flight. He builds a moving city, a testament to his power so magnificent that the journey itself becomes more famous than the destination. The assembly of this caravan was a logistical feat that would make a modern military planner weep with envy. This wasn't a procession, it was a migration. Let's talk numbers and try to wrap our heads around them. The total party consisted of 60,000 people. 60,000. That's the population of a respectable modern city. This included a full army escort of 10,000 soldiers to guard the procession, not just from bandits, but likely from the sheer gravitational pull of its own wealth. It included doctors, teachers, drummers, and most importantly, griots, the oral historians and storytellers who were the living libraries of the Mandinka people. Their job was to sing the praises of the Mansa, to recite the epic of Sundiata, and to ensure that every moment of this grand spectacle was recorded for posterity. But the core of the caravan was Musa's personal retinue. This was a group of 12,000 people, every single one of them a personal attendant or slave, and every single one of them was dressed in the finest Persian silk and gold brocade. Imagine the sight: a river of 12,000 people flowing through the desert, shimmering in the sun like a mirage made of silk. And ahead of Musa himself, as he rode on horseback, walked 500 heralds also draped in silk, each carrying a staff of solid gold, weighing about 6 pounds each. That's 3,000 pounds of gold just for the walking sticks. And then there was the gold itself, the actual money. Musa wasn't carrying a few chests of treasure for expenses. He brought with him a mobile treasury designed to be given away. The sources tell us he had a train of between 80 and 100 camels, and each camel was loaded with 300 pounds of pure gold dust. Let's do the math on the conservative side. 80 camels, 300 pounds each. That's 24,000 pounds of gold. In today's money, the value is, well, it's basically impossible to calculate because introducing that much gold into the market would crash the price completely. But just the raw value before the economic impact is in the billions of dollars. And let's be very clear about this. This was not the state treasury of Mali. This wasn't the empire's strategic reserve. This was Musa's personal travel fund. This was his pocket money. To move this golden city required a miracle of organization. An army of servants and workers managed the logistics, ensuring that tens of thousands of people and thousands of animals were fed and watered every single day as they crossed one of the most hostile environments on Earth. This caravan was more than just an expression of wealth. It was a statement of competence. It showed that the Mali Empire was not some primitive backwater that just got lucky with a gold mine. It was a sophisticated, organized, and powerful state, capable of projecting its power and its glory thousands of miles from its own borders. Now, picture the scene. The caravan leaves the lush, green capital of Niani and heads north, towards the desert. As it moves, it passes through the great trading cities of the empire, like Walata. In each city, Musa's reputation for piety and generosity precedes him. He gives out alms to the poor, funds the construction of new mosques, and showers local dignitaries with gifts of gold. He is behaving as a great king should, but these are his own cities. The gold he's spending here is just moving from one part of the imperial economy to another. It's what happens when this self-contained ecosystem of wealth slams into the outside world that the real story begins. The caravan enters the Sahara. The real journey starts now, and here the sheer surrealism of the scene is dialed up to 11. The Sahara Desert is a place of brutal extremes. During the day, it's a furnace, a sun-blasted wasteland of rock and sand where the horizon shimmers with heat. At night, the temperature plummets to near freezing. It is vast, empty, and actively trying to kill you. It is a landscape designed to strip away all vanity, all luxury, all pretense, and reduce man to his most basic struggle for survival. But Mansa Musa's caravan was a rejection of that reality. It was an island of impossible luxury floating on a sea of desolation. Imagine you're a lone Tuareg nomad, watching from a rocky outcrop as this procession appears on the horizon. First, you hear the distant sound of drums, a rhythmic pulse in the dead silence of the desert. Then you see the cloud of dust. And then the thing itself emerges. It's not just a caravan. It's a moving river of humanity and animals that stretches for miles. You see the vanguard of 10,000 soldiers, their spears glinting in the sun. You see the shimmering silk of the 12,000 attendants. You see the 500 heralds with their golden staffs, walking before a king on a magnificent charger, himself so richly adorned he's almost difficult to look at. You see the long line of camels, laden not just with gold, but with everything needed to sustain this city: food, water, tents, cookware, and fine carpets. At night, the show would be even more spectacular. In the middle of the empty, black desert, a city of thousands of tents would spring up. Torches would illuminate a scene of incredible opulence. While the desert wind howled outside, inside the royal enclosure, Musa would be dining on fine meals prepared by his chefs, listening to poetry and music performed by his court musicians. He had brought his entire royal court with him. He had essentially scooped up the heart of his capital city and transplanted it into the most inhospitable place on earth. It was an act of such supreme, audacious confidence it bordered on defying God and nature itself. The message was clear. The world has rules, the desert has rules, but those rules do not apply to the Mansa of Mali. After months of this grueling, magnificent journey, they crossed the desert and saw the green, fertile lands of the Nile Valley. They had arrived in Egypt, the land of the Mamluks. They had arrived in Cairo. Cairo in the 14th century wasn't just a city, it was the city. It was bigger than Paris, bigger than London, bigger than Rome. It was the intellectual, cultural, and economic center of the Islamic world. It had a population of 500,000 people. Its skyline was a forest of minarets from hundreds of mosques. Its markets, the khans, were legendary, filled with goods from as far away as China and India. Spices, silks, porcelain, perfumes, books. If it was valuable, you could find it in Cairo. The city was a nexus of power, protected by the citadel, a massive fortress looming over the metropolis. The ruler of this domain was Sultan al-Nasir Mohammed. This was a man who was used to being the center of the universe. He'd been on and off the throne 3 times, a veteran of brutal Mamluk power politics. He was a great builder, a patron of the arts, and a man who received emissaries from the greatest kings of Europe and Asia. He was powerful, cynical, and not easily impressed. When he first heard reports of a great king arriving from the south, from the land of the Takrur, as they called West Africa, he was probably intrigued, but not exactly trembling. He would receive this sub-Saharan king, accept his gifts, and send him on his way to Mecca. Standard procedure. He had no idea what was about to hit him. The arrival of Mansa Musa's caravan wasn't like a standard diplomatic mission. It was like a circus, an army, and a royal wedding crashing into the city all at once. The sheer number of people overwhelmed the city's resources. The amount of gold they were carrying was a rumor that spread through the markets like wildfire. The Cairenes, who thought they had seen everything, were stunned into silence. Who was this king? Where did this empire of gold come from? It was as if a king from a forgotten legend had suddenly walked into the real world. Sultan al-Nasir Mohammed invited Mansa Musa to the citadel for a formal meeting. And this is where we get our first real taste of Musa the man, not just the legend. This meeting was a carefully choreographed dance of diplomacy and power, and Musa proved he was just as skilled in this arena as he was on the battlefield. There was a strict protocol for meeting the Sultan. Any visitor, no matter how royal, was expected to perform the zaminbos, which meant kissing the ground and the Sultan's hand. It was a clear acknowledgement of the Sultan's superior rank and authority. It was a ritual of submission, and everyone did it. Kings, ambassadors, generals. It was just how things were done. But when Mansa Musa was ushered into the grand audience hall of the citadel and the protocol was explained to him, he refused, politely but firmly. He was a devout Muslim, he explained, and he would only prostrate himself before Allah, before God. He could not bow to any man. Now, we have to understand the gravity of this moment. This was a massive, public challenge to the Sultan's authority, right in the heart of his own fortress. It was an electrifying moment of tension. The Mamluk courtiers must have been scandalized. Refusing the zaminbos was an insult, a declaration of rebellion almost. For a moment, this friendly diplomatic visit was on the verge of becoming a major international incident. Musa was making a calculated statement. He was not some minor tribal chief coming to beg for favors. He was the Mansa of Mali, an emperor in his own right, and he considered himself the equal of any ruler on earth, including the mighty Sultan of Cairo. He was demanding to be treated as such. Sultan al-Nasir Mohammed was a shrewd politician. He could have taken offense, thrown Musa out, or worse. But he also recognized he was dealing with someone out of the ordinary, and he was likely intrigued by this proud king from the south. A compromise was quickly and cleverly reached. Musa was escorted to a part of the hall where he could see the Sultan, and there he knelt and proclaimed, "I prostrate myself before God who created me." He bowed to his God, but in the direction of the Sultan. Honor was satisfied on both sides. The Sultan had his gesture of respect, and Musa had made his point. He had not bowed to a man. He had met the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world as an equal. The diplomatic dance was a success. Musa was offered a palace for his stay and treated with every honor. And now, comfortable and respected in the greatest city on earth, Mansa Musa started to do what he had come to do, spend his money. And this is where the story tips over from a tale of kings and politics into something else entirely. It becomes a lesson in economics, a case study in what happens when the abstract concept of wealth collides with the hard reality of a market. Musa's generosity was boundless. He and his retinue dove into the legendary markets of Cairo. They bought everything: Silks, spices, books, weapons, and souvenirs of every kind. And they didn't haggle. In fact, they did the opposite. If a merchant asked for 10 dinars for a piece of cloth, Musa's men would give him 20 or 50. Musa himself, when he visited the royal court or the homes of various dignitaries, would hand out gifts of gold to everyone. His courtiers, his hosts, their servants, the guards at the door, everyone got a piece of the action. Every Friday, we're told, he would fund the construction of a new mosque. He gave away so much gold that the poor and needy of Cairo, who lined the streets to see his procession, were showered with golden dust. For 3 months, Mansa Musa stayed in Cairo, and for 3 months, he opened the floodgates of his treasury and poured a river of gold into the city's economy. On the surface, this looks like an act of incredible piety and generosity, and it probably was in Musa's mind. He was being a good guest. He was being a good Muslim, giving alms. He came from a place where gold was an abundant natural resource, like stone or wood. He simply had no frame of reference for its value in a finely tuned monetary system like Cairo's. He treated gold just like we treat loose change, something you give away without a thought. But the consequences of this generosity were catastrophic. He had, in a very short time, dramatically increased the money supply in the city. And as any freshman economics student can tell you, when you flood a market with cash, you get one thing: inflation. Massive, crippling hyperinflation. Let's put it in modern terms. Imagine you live in a small town. A loaf of bread costs $5. A gallon of gas costs $4. Now, imagine a fleet of helicopters appears overhead and starts dropping millions and millions of $100 bills onto the streets. For the first hour, it's a party. Everyone is rich. But what happens the next day? You go to the bakery to buy bread. The baker looks at your $5 bill. Why would he want that? He has a garbage bag full of hundreds at home. To get him to even bother firing up his oven, you'll have to offer him $100 for that loaf of bread, or $200. The gas station owner, he won't even turn on the pumps for less than $500 a gallon. The value of your money hasn't changed, but its purchasing power has collapsed. Your life savings, that $10,000 you had in the bank, can now barely buy you a week's worth of groceries. This is exactly what Mansa Musa did to Cairo, but he did it with gold. The price of the gold dinar, the standard currency of the region, plummeted. People who had their life savings in gold found themselves ruined almost overnight. The price of everyday goods, bread, oil, wheat, skyrocketed because the value of the money used to buy them had been destroyed. People who lived on fixed incomes were devastated. Merchants who had built their businesses on stable commodity prices were wiped out. Musa's 3-month-long party created an economic depression that would cripple the entire region for more than a decade. The Arab historian al-Makhrizi, writing decades later, noted that the Cairo market still hadn't fully recovered from the great mischief caused by Musa's visit. Mansa Musa, the king from the land of gold, had shown the world the power of his wealth. But he had done it in the most chaotic and destructive way imaginable. He had demonstrated his power by breaking one of the most sophisticated economies on Earth. It's unlikely this was his intention. He was a savvy politician and a brilliant administrator in his own realm. But his own realm operated on a different economic logic. He was a man who thought of wealth in terms of stockpiles and tribute, not in terms of currency valuation and market stability. In Cairo, he learned a brutal lesson. In a connected world, wealth isn't just about how much you have, it's about what its value is relative to everything else. And by giving so much of it away, he had, paradoxically, destroyed its value. Unaware of the full scale of the economic chaos he had left in his wake, Mansa Musa and his magnificent, shimmering caravan left Cairo and headed east, towards the ultimate destination of their journey, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He had made his grand entrance onto the world stage. He had announced the power of the Mali Empire with a bang. But the most important part of his journey, the part that would truly transform him as a ruler and a man, was still to come. He was leaving behind a city in economic turmoil, but he was heading towards a personal and spiritual reckoning. After leaving the economic wreckage of Cairo smoldering behind him, Mansa Musa and his golden caravan continued their journey into the heart of the Arabian Peninsula. The landscape grew even more stark, more sacred. They were entering the Hijaz, the cradle of Islam. The mood of the procession began to shift. The ostentatious display of wealth, while still present, was now secondary to the spiritual purpose of the mission. This was no longer just a political statement. It was the culmination of a deeply held faith. Their arrival in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina was the spiritual climax of the entire 4,000-mile journey. Here, in the very places where the Prophet Muhammad had lived, preached, and received his revelations, Mansa Musa was no longer just an emperor. He was a pilgrim, a haji, one among thousands of believers from every corner of the known world. He would have shed his extravagant royal attire for the simple white robes of the ihram, the traditional pilgrim's dress that symbolizes the equality of all believers before God. Imagine the scene in Mecca at the Grand Mosque, the Masjid al-Haram. Musa, the man who commanded 60,000 people and carried literally tons of gold, would have performed the tawaf, circumambulating the Kaaba, that simple, black, cube-shaped building that is the most sacred site in Islam. He would have walked and prayed alongside commoners, merchants, scholars, and soldiers from Persia, India, Andalusia, and Syria. For a man of such immense, isolating power, this must have been a profoundly humbling and grounding experience. He would have performed the sa'i, running between the hills of Safa and Marwa, and stood in prayer on the plain of Arafat. He participated in every ritual, not as a king observing from a distance, but as an active and devout participant. But even here, in this state of pious humility, he couldn't stop being Mansa Musa. His generosity continued, but it was now channeled in a more focused and, in his view, more righteous direction. He still gave out enormous sums of gold, but now it was directed towards religious and charitable ends. He gave gifts to the sharifs of Mecca, the descendants of the Prophet who governed the holy city. He paid for the lodgings and food of other, less fortunate pilgrims from West Africa who had made the arduous journey. He endowed religious foundations and paid for the upkeep and renovation of mosques and schools, not only in Mecca and Medina, but in every city he passed through on his route. His reputation for piety and open-handedness became legendary in the holy cities. He was seen as the ideal Muslim king, one who combined immense worldly power with genuine devotion. He spent so lavishly that chroniclers of the time wrote that his name was on the lips of everyone from the Red Sea to the heart of the Islamic world. He had successfully completed the Hajj, fulfilling one of the 5 pillars of his faith. He had cemented his reputation as a great and pious ruler. And now, it was time to go home. The journey back to Mali would be just as long and arduous, but Mansa Musa was returning as a different man. He was no longer just an emperor. He was Al-Hajj Mansa Musa, a title of immense prestige. But he was also about to get some very bad news from the city he had so recently dazzled. As the great caravan began its long march back towards Cairo, word started to reach him of the consequences of his visit. Merchants traveling from Egypt told stories of the chaos in the markets. They told him how the value of gold had hit rock bottom, how the price of everything else had gone through the roof, and how the economic life of the great city had been thrown into disarray. Musa, the brilliant administrator who prided himself on the peace and stability of his own empire, was now confronted with the fact that his actions had caused instability and suffering on a massive scale. The man we see in this moment is not an arrogant king who shrugs off the consequences of his actions. The historical accounts suggest he was genuinely shocked and concerned. He had intended to display his glory, not to wreck an entire economy. His legacy as a great ruler was now stained by this colossal, if unintentional, blunder. He had built his reputation in Mecca as a pious and generous king, but he had left behind a trail of economic destruction. And so, on his return journey, he decided to do something that is, frankly, astonishing. He decided to fix the problem he had created. When the caravan arrived back in Cairo, Musa embarked on one of the most remarkable and bizarre acts of macroeconomic policy in medieval history. He, the man who had given away gold like it was candy, now set about trying to pull it back out of the market. He went to the same Cairene merchants and money lenders that he had flooded with his wealth, and he did the unthinkable. He asked to borrow money. Let that sink in. The richest man in the world was asking for a loan. He borrowed back his own gold, and he didn't just borrow it, he insisted on borrowing it at exorbitant rates of interest. He was deliberately taking on massive debts to the merchants of Cairo. The merchants, who must have been utterly bewildered by this turn of events, were more than happy to oblige. Lending money to the king from the land of gold at high interest seemed like the deal of a lifetime. But Musa knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't an act of desperation. It was a calculated economic intervention. By borrowing vast sums of gold, he was single-handedly taking that gold back out of circulation. He was reducing the money supply. This act created an artificial scarcity, which in turn began to drive the value of gold back up. It was a rudimentary form of what modern central banks do all the time, using open market operations to control the money supply and stabilize currency value. Musa was, in essence, performing a one-man quantitative tightening. He was trying to reverse the inflation he had caused. For the first time in history, so far as we know, a single individual's personal financial decisions were powerful enough to first break, and then attempt to repair, the economy of a major world region. This act was so audacious, so unprecedented, that it cemented his legend forever. He was no longer just the king who had so much gold he broke the market. He was now also the king who was so rich he could single-handedly prop it up again. And this brings us to a fascinating point of debate. Was this a truly sophisticated, proto-Keynesian economic policy, an intuitive grasp of supply and demand from a brilliant ruler trying to correct a market failure? Or was it something simpler? Was it just a desperate, face-saving measure? A man who had caused a huge mess through his own naivety trying to clean it up, no matter the cost, just to restore his own reputation. I'm genuinely curious what you guys think. Was this a stroke of economic genius or just the world's most expensive apology? Whatever his motivation, his intervention worked to a degree. He managed to restore some value to the gold dinar, though the Cairene economy would still feel the shock of his visit for years to come. But this experience seems to have fundamentally changed Mansa Musa's perspective on wealth and power. His journey home was not just a retreat, it was a new kind of mission. He had left Mali with the goal of showing the world his gold. He was now returning with a new, more ambitious goal, to bring the world back to Mali. Not the world's gold, but its knowledge, its culture, its art, and its architecture. The first phase of his reign was about accumulating and displaying power. The second phase would be about building a lasting legacy. And this new mission began on the journey home. Musa was now actively recruiting talent. He wasn't just buying souvenirs anymore. He was headhunting. He sought out the best and brightest minds he could find in Cairo and the other great cities he passed through. He offered scholars, doctors, scientists, and artists incredible sums of money and the promise of royal patronage if they would agree to return with him to Mali. He was embarking on a massive brain drain of the Islamic world's intellectual centers, pulling that talent south, back to his own empire. His most important and famous recruit was a man named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. Al-Sahili was a poet and an architect from the recently fallen Islamic kingdom of Granada in Andalusia, Spain. He was a product of the sophisticated and beautiful Moorish culture that had produced wonders like the Alhambra. Musa met him in Mecca, was captivated by his intellect and artistic vision, and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. The sources say Musa gave al-Sahili 200 kilograms of gold, that's nearly 450 pounds, just to convince him to come to Mali. The recruitment of al-Sahili signals a pivotal shift in Musa's entire project. He was no longer just exporting raw materials, gold, to the rest of the world. He was now importing intellectual capital. He understood that true, lasting power wasn't just about what you could dig out of the ground. It was about what you could build, what you could write, what you could think. He had seen the magnificent mosques of Cairo and the learned academies of the Islamic world, and he wanted that for his own people. He didn't just want to be rich. He wanted his empire to be great, in the deepest sense of the word. The journey home was also marked by a personal tragedy that underscored the precariousness of life, even for the most powerful of men. Along the way, his favorite and chief wife, the Empress Inari Khanate, fell ill and died. Musa was said to be devastated by the loss. In her honor, he ordered a magnificent tomb and mosque to be built at the site of her death. This personal loss may have further deepened his desire to build things that would last, to create a legacy that would outlive not just him, but everyone he loved. As the caravan, now laden with books and scholars instead of just gold, finally re-entered the borders of the Mali Empire, it was a profoundly different entity from the one that had left. It had departed on a mission of demonstration. It was returning on a mission of transformation. Mansa Musa had left as a provincial king, albeit a ridiculously wealthy one. He was returning as a true world figure, a man who had seen the great centers of civilization and was now determined to build one of his own in the heart of West Africa. He had gone out to put his empire on the map. Now he was going to turn that spot on the map into a global destination. The gold rush was over. The golden age was about to begin. The return of Mansa Musa to the Mali Empire in 1327 was more than just the end of a long journey. It was the beginning of a cultural revolution. The Great Caravan, which had left 90 years earlier as a shimmering statement of raw wealth, now returned as a vessel of knowledge and ambition. The most precious cargo was no longer the gold in its chests, but the scholars, architects, and ideas in its retinue. Mansa Musa had seen the wonders of the world, and now he was going to build them at home. His first and most immediate goal was to transform the key cities of his empire into centers of architecture and learning that could rival what he had seen in Cairo and Mecca. The focus of this monumental effort was the city that would become synonymous with his legacy, Timbuktu. When Musa had conquered Timbuktu on his way to Mecca, it was already an important and wealthy trading post, a dusty but prosperous terminus for the trans-Saharan caravans. But Musa envisioned something far grander. He wanted to turn it from a marketplace into a metropolis. And the man he chose to realize this vision was his prized recruit, the Andalusian architect and poet, Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. Musa commissioned al-Sahili to build a new, magnificent royal palace, and most importantly, a new great mosque, the Jingreber Mosque. This project would become the cornerstone of Mali's architectural renaissance. Al-Sahili brought with him the sophisticated techniques of North African and Andalusian construction. But he didn't just replicate what he knew. He adapted his methods to the local environment, using the materials at hand. The primary building material in the Sahel was not stone or marble, but banco, or mud brick, reinforced with wood. What emerged was a stunning and revolutionary fusion of styles. The Jingreber Mosque combined the grand scale and pyramidal minaret of West African traditions with the intricate arches and complex design principles of the Islamic Mediterranean. The result was something entirely new, a unique style of Sudano-Sahelian architecture that was perfectly adapted to its climate and culture. The mosque was not only a place of worship, but a marvel of engineering, designed to stay cool in the blistering Sahelian heat. It still stands today, nearly 700 years later, a testament to the vision of these two men, the African king and the Spanish architect. But Musa's ambition for Timbuktu went far beyond beautiful buildings. He understood that a great city needed more than just a magnificent skyline. It needed a soul. And for him, that soul was knowledge. He set about transforming Timbuktu into one of the world's great centers of learning. He used his immense wealth to fund the expansion of the city's existing mosques and schools into a full-fledged university, the University of Sankore. The Sankore Madrasa, as it was known, became a magnet for scholars from across the Islamic world. Musa's agents fanned out across North Africa and the Middle East, buying up entire libraries of books on theology, law, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. The trade in books in Timbuktu soon became, astonishingly, even more profitable than the trade in gold or salt. A scholar who arrived in the city with a rare manuscript could make a fortune. The university was organized differently from the universities of Europe. It was more like a collection of independent colleges, each with its own master scholar. Students would come from all over the world to study under a specific master, and upon completing their rigorous studies, they would receive a traditional turban, symbolizing their graduation and their status as a qualified scholar. At its peak, the University of Sankore is said to have housed the largest collection of books in Africa since the Library of Alexandria, and to have had a capacity for 25,000 students in a city of 100,000 people. Timbuktu had become the city of 333 saints, a beacon of light and learning, where the most valuable commodity was not the gold buried in the earth, but the knowledge written on the page. Mansa Musa had succeeded. He had built his own Cairo, his own Mecca, in the heart of West Africa, and the world had taken notice. The golden pilgrimage had worked better than Musa could have ever imagined. Before his journey, the Mali Empire was a rumor, a whisper of a rich land to the south. After his journey, it was a legend. European and Arab merchants, geographers, and kings were all obsessed with this newly discovered kingdom and its impossibly wealthy ruler. The story of the king who broke the bank in Cairo spread throughout the trade routes and royal courts of the world. The most famous and concrete evidence of this new global awareness is a map, one of the most important maps ever made, the Catalan Atlas of 1375. Created on the island of Majorca, a center of Jewish and Christian cartography, this beautiful and detailed world map was a compendium of all the geographical knowledge available to Europeans at the time. And right in the middle of West Africa, a region that had previously been a blank space, the mapmakers drew a king. He is seated on a throne, wearing a golden crown and holding a golden scepter in one hand. And in the other hand, he holds up a massive, gleaming nugget of pure gold, offering it to a North African trader on a camel. Next to the image, the caption reads, "This black lord is called Musmeli, lord of the Negroes of Guinea. This king is the richest and most noble lord of all this region, on account of the abundance of gold, which is gathered in his land." This image is the moment that the myth of West African gold was crystallized in the European imagination. For centuries to come, this image of Mansa Musa and his giant gold nugget would fuel a European obsession with finding the source of this incredible wealth. It sparked a hunger for exploration and eventually for conquest. It was this legend, born from Musa's spectacular pilgrimage, that would, over a century later, help to inspire Portuguese explorers like Henry the Navigator to begin inching their way down the African coast, hoping to bypass the North African middlemen and find the source of the gold for themselves. In a very real and direct way, Mansa Musa's journey to advertise his empire's wealth ultimately planted the seeds of the age of exploration, and with it, the age of European colonialism in Africa. The very act that put his empire on the map also, tragically, put a target on its back. Mansa Musa ruled for about 25 years in total, and his reign is universally considered the zenith, the absolute golden age of the Mali Empire. But empires, like men, are mortal, and the strength of the Mali Empire was also its greatest weakness. It was built around the genius and charisma of singular, powerful individuals like Sundiata and Mansa Musa. And replacing a man like Musa is an almost impossible task. He died around the year 1337. The exact circumstances of his death are unrecorded, but he left behind an empire that was peaceful, prosperous, and globally renowned. He was succeeded by his son, Magan I, and Magan, unfortunately, was not his father. Where Musa was a brilliant administrator and military strategist, Magan was reportedly a weak and ineffective ruler. He reigned for only 4 years, and in that short time, he managed to lose the two most important cities his father had conquered. The strategic city of Gao was retaken by its former rulers, and a Mossi army from the south successfully raided and burned the jewel of the empire, Timbuktu. Magan's short and disastrous reign was a sign of things to come. The throne passed to Musa's brother, Suleiman, who was a much more capable ruler. He managed to restore order and stability, and the empire enjoyed another period of peace and prosperity under his rule. The great traveler Ibn Battuta visited during Suleiman's reign, and his writings give us a vivid picture of a well-ordered, secure, and sophisticated state. But after Suleiman, the empire entered a period of slow, steady decline. A series of weak and short-lived rulers came to the throne. The central authority of the Mansa weakened, and internal squabbles and succession crises became common. The vast provinces on the fringes of the empire, which had been held together by the strength and prestige of Musa, began to break away. Rebellions flared up. Powerful new states, like the rising Songhai Empire based in the city of Gao that Magan had lost, began to challenge Mali's dominance over the region. Over the next 2 centuries, the Mali Empire slowly crumbled. It was never conquered in a single, decisive battle. It just gradually fragmented, shrinking back to its original core territory, the Mandinka heartland. The gold trade was rerouted to new, rising powers. The great cities of Jen and Timbuktu were eventually absorbed into the rival Songhai Empire. By the 16th century, the great Mali Empire that Mansa Musa had ruled was a shadow of its former self, a minor regional power living in the memory of its past glory. Its golden age was over. So what, in the end, is the legacy of Mansa Musa, the richest man who ever lived? It's a story of incredible paradoxes. His legendary pilgrimage was an act of both profound piety and canny global branding. His boundless generosity brought him fame and prestige, but it also caused economic chaos and suffering. The very act of putting his empire on the map made it a target for future predators. He transformed Timbuktu into a world-class center of learning, a legacy of knowledge that endured for centuries. Yet the political empire that supported it proved fragile and could not outlive him by very long. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about his wealth is that it defies our modern attempts to put a number on it. People love to throw out figures like $400 billion, but these calculations are meaningless. They miss the point. Musa's wealth wasn't a number in a bank account. It was a fundamental force. He was so rich that his personal financial decisions affected the geopolitical landscape. He was so rich that he could, by himself, alter the value of the world's most precious metal. His wealth was not a measure of what he could buy. It was a measure of the power he could exert on the world simply by existing. His story is a powerful reminder that history is full of massive, sophisticated, and influential civilizations that are often left out of our traditional narratives. The story of the world in the 14th century is not just a story of European squabbles and Middle Eastern power centers. It's also the story of a vast and powerful West African empire, led by a man whose vision and ambition changed the world he lived in. He built libraries in the desert. He commanded armies of thousands. And for a brief, shining moment, he held so much of the world's gold in his hands that he could bend the global economy to his will. His name was Mansa Musa, and his story shows us that the history of power, wealth, and civilization is far richer and more complex than we often imagine. And that's where the story of Mansa Musa comes to its dramatic close. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, do us a huge favor and hit that like button and subscribe to Beast History so you don't miss what's next. We've got so many more insane stories ready for you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.